was hoping we could talk about what's going on in Ukraine, because we haven't even been able to give like an update to I don't feel like I know enough really to talk about. Like, to me, it's just a usual pissing match. We're just trying to, what's
Well, we saw the president of Ukraine come out the other day and say, no.
Manufacturer consent. That's what I was thinking.
This is not what you think. And if we needed help, we would call for it.
Right.
And so what has been your intel as far as what you've seen so far? Because it looks like, the MIC is just they're itching for a reason to ramp up the war machine. And quite frankly, Sam, as I'm sure you know, being in D.C., with Biden's approval rating and the entire Democratic Party basically going literally through the toilet right now, the scariest thing when that happens is the prospect of war to try to bump up the numbers. As sad and sick as that is, that seems to be the case. What's your observation in terms of where things are at right now?
Well, it's not a great situation over there. Obviously, we can kind of dig more into that. But I think a critical question is what's changed recently with the situation in Ukraine, because this goes back to 2014, in which, we've had fighting in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, going back to 2014 when the Yanukovych government fell. There were protests in Kyiv. He fled to Russia, and then that installed a new government basically in Ukraine that wanted closer ties to Western Europe, to NATO. And Russia responded in 2014 by, we know about the annexation of Crimea, and also by sending some military assets into eastern Ukraine to what it claims to support citizens there that opposed the coup, what they described as the coup in Kiev. And there's been sort of low-grade warfare ever since then. So what's changed? And that's been pretty much tolerable to the U.S. and most of the world for the last 8 years, the situation in eastern Ukraine. What's changed in the last few months, I guess, is the Russians have put more troops on the border. There's always been troops on the border. The quantity has changed. The Russians claim they're involved in drills and military tests and things like that, exercises and maneuvers that are supposed to last until the end of the month. We'll see what happens then. But what's wild is, in response to this, the U.S. has deployed some extremely bellicose rhetoric, accusing the Russians of launching an imminent invasion, claiming an invasion was imminent, claiming that they had enough troops to take Kiev in 2 days. And we've seen the Pentagon activate 10,000 U.S. troops on war footing, including sending 3,000 to Eastern Europe, not to Ukraine, but to Eastern Europe to bolster NATO allies. Ukraine, obviously not a member of NATO, but the idea of Russian troops on the border of a country that borders NATO is enough to, I guess, activate some troops to send over to those allies. So there's whether your thesis holds that this is, in response to bad poll numbers, this also came in response to the Omicron surge, in which deaths were, spiraling out of control last month. That's not to discount. There are legitimate concerns that what Russia is doing in eastern Ukraine, which isn't justifiable. I'm not going to defend Russia. That's Putin runs a conservative government over there. But the situation has been blown a bit out of proportion by the U.S. and the U.S. has actually been scolded by allies in Europe for letting the rhetoric get out of control. The foreign minister in Ukraine has said, don't buy into the doomsday talk. They're not freaking out in Ukraine. So the question is, why should Americans be freaking out? Why is the White House freaking out here?
That's a very good point. We're speaking with Sam Sachs of Means TV. When we see the lack of response from corporate media, what a surprise. And then it becomes this whole left-right divide when somebody like Tucker Carlson says we don't need to go to war there.
Yeah.
And you're not seeing others step up and say, yeah, this is really not a good idea. It just creates this unnecessary rift that has already been exacerbated in so many ways.
Isn't that the point?
Maybe so, but again, partisan politics should have nothing to do with what our foreign policy is. Unfortunately, as you know, it plays a big role. Why do you think so many people have been so silent on this?
Well, this is a pretty nasty political environment in which people don't want to be associated with being pro-Russia. And that goes back to Russia. Well, I mean, first off, the neocons have been playing this game for a while and have had Russia in their crosshairs for, decades. So liberals got into the game too. Liberals have always been in this game. They've always been involved in the Cold War. But they really ramped it up with the election of Donald Trump and propagating Russiagate stuff. So it's a pretty nasty political environment to speak up and say anything that might be construed as advancing Russian propaganda or at least supporting Russian interests. You did see, and I would caution some of the right wingers who have spoken out against this, people like Josh Hawley, Matt Gaetz, Tucker Carlson. They always usually couch their objections in terms of we need to keep our resources available to counter the real threat, which is China. They're usually, if you don't want war with Russia because you want war with China, you're still a neocon, right? You're not taking any sort of principled anti-war stance there. But you did have Bernie Sanders, who I think has been the most forceful in speaking out for peace in the region, publish an op-ed in The Guardian this week.
It was great.
And what was surprising about it is he didn't just speak in sort of the general platitudes that you've heard some members of Congress on the left speak out, like we don't need war with Ukraine, we need to pursue diplomatic solutions. He actually went and spoke to what Russia's security interests are in the region, what is at the root of this conflict, which is the expansion of NATO. Yeah. We are in this situation because a Western military alliance that was formed to counter the Soviet Union, explicitly to counter the Soviet Union, has grown all the way to now include countries that border Russia. Is broken promises that were made in the 90s to Russia that it wouldn't expand east of Germany. It's expanded far east of Germany. And now there are basically two countries left that aren't in that region that aren't a part of NATO, Ukraine and Belarus. And Ukraine wants to be a part of, or at least some members are, it's hard to figure out the polling within Ukraine on this issue. It does look like—
I was going to ask you that. Like, what do they want?
Well, I mean, it does look like a majority of the country does want to have closer ties with Europe. And, that's somewhat understandable given the way that Russia has aggressively acted toward Ukraine recently. But, it depends on where you are in the country. The Ukraine has very different interests. Eastern Ukraine from Western Ukraine. East of Kiev, you have people who have a lot closer ties to Russia. And that's why you've had this sustained conflict in Ukraine since 2014, is because there is actual opposition to Kiev's plans to move closer to NATO and the EU and Western Europe. So while there might be a majority, there's pretty hardened opposition in eastern Ukraine. And there are all sorts of troubling political elements within Kiev, within the new government. In fact, you have within the security state, you have the Azov Battalion, which is a blatantly fascist white nationalist battalion that was a private or that was a kind of a private militia that was then integrated into the security forces of Ukraine. So there are people who do not agree with the direction that the current within Ukraine, that don't agree with the current direction that the government, which a lot of people deem as illegitimate because it took over essentially after what some people describe as a coup. Russia claims that the U.S. was involved in this coup. You did have U.S. senators walking around Maidan handing out candy and supplies to protesters at the time. Whether that would be defined as playing a role in a coup, I'm not sure. But clearly, the U.S. was interested and pleased with the results of what happened. So, yeah, it's hard to gauge internal polling in Ukraine on this issue. Ultimately, sure, yes, a country does have a right to decide for itself what it wants to do. But the point that, getting back to Bernie Sanders' op-ed, is NATO also has to consider decisions it makes, whether or not including certain countries into its alliance undermines the alliance, creates regional instability. And that's the case when it comes to Ukraine. It's clearly creating instability in the region. There are other countries like Finland, an advanced democracy in Europe that borders Russia, that's chosen not to be a member of NATO to avoid such conflicts. So if people genuinely want peace, if people genuinely want a resolution in Ukraine, the easiest way to get there is for NATO to say, look, we're not going to seek Ukraine's membership into our military alliance. Ukraine can find resources in Western Europe. They can start minding their own, energy resources and such. They can have open markets with the rest of the world and everything like that. And Russia would largely be fine with that. But if you look at the demands here, it's clearly about Ukraine joining NATO. It's about NATO weaponry being placed in Ukraine. It's about nukes being placed in the region. All seem like fairly reasonable demands. The U.S. wouldn't want a government like Mexico to be a part of an adversarial military alliance. The U.S. wouldn't want Russia putting nukes in Mexico. So if we want to not be hypocritical here, then that's the reasonable solution, is to take Ukraine admittance into NATO off the table. And that's essentially what Bernie Sanders argued for in this op-ed, which is a pretty brave position to take in U.S. politics these days.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.